Hello, everybody. I'd like to introduce you to Rhys from Flexport. Our subject matter today is the current air freight and sea freight marketplace. Thanks for joining us today, Rhys.
Thank you, David. It's a privilege to be invited on and share the side of freight forwarding, which people don't normally see. Really excited to join today and to have a good discussion on supply chain.
Good. Thank you. So tell us a bit about your business, what you do, and where it fits in the supply chain.
Yeah, so we're first and foremost we're a freight forwarding business. So we provide primarily air freight and ocean freight services for businesses, whether that's importing or exporting. We also provide financing solutions for buying inventory as well as extended freight and duty payments. Primarily it's providing the air freight and ocean freight services. And the difference that we have as a business compared to traditional freight forwarders is that we're also a software provider as well. So we've got a very much a tech-driven software package that allows importers to have full visibility of their freight, but also their inventory as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And I ask everyone this question, and it may be the same for you. What brought you into the lovely logistics sector?
Like quite a few people, I stumbled into it really. So I got my A-levels, left school. I wasn't overly keen to join, do university, and so I got a job in a warehouse on the Slough trading estate as 18 years old, being a pickpacker for a fulfillment company, doing I think it was the WH Smith point of sale and requisites back then. So I did that for 9 months, and then a guy I actually played cricket with was a TNT Express delivery driver, and I was having a chat with him one afternoon at the cricket, and kind of mentioning that I was keen to try something new. And then next week he go back to the TNT depot, spoke to the general manager, and who was keen to meet me. And then I think I went in on a Monday evening at 5 o'clock and left at 8 p.m. with a job as an indoor sales executive on the TNT same day team. So it all kind of came really from talking to a mate who was a TNT Express driver, and I was 19 when I got my first job as an indoor sales executive for the TNT same day.
Oh, well done. And a lot of people found that, have come into it the same way, more by accident than planned. But once you get into it, you love it. So, maybe if you can sort of paint the picture, of the sort of air freight and sea freight marketplace, because I imagine, it's very volatile. It must change throughout the year because of supply and demand. So if you can give us an overview for those, including myself, that are not experts in its sector, you could just paint a picture of how it works, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we start with air freight, when you go on holiday and you're sitting there watching what's going on outside of the window of your luggage being loaded into the bottom of the aircraft, when you're flying outside of Europe, a certain space on that aircraft is called the underbelly of a plane. And it's where the airlines can sell space on their aircraft that's not utilised, technically by the luggage. So this really enables businesses to access markets directly without having to go through sort of centralised hubs within Europe, for example, that works on the courier model. But also, what you typically find with air freight is that the goods will start at sort of the 70 kilo plus mark. So whereas the express businesses are starting for a document that's half a kilo, we really get involved when something's on a pallet or it weighs at least as a consignment size 70 kilos up. And this can go traditionally up to 3, 4, 5 ton or even higher. So on air freight, there's a couple of different methods of shipping via air freight. One is via commercial airlines, which is called passenger aircraft, which is, like what I said, like buying space on the passenger planes. You then get freighter planes as well, which is where you're shipping, where people like Lufthansa, for example, will have a freighter plane going from Germany over to China, and that will fully be just cargo on there, which businesses can buy. It allows businesses to enter the markets directly, and there's a variety of different service levels that can be used for that. For ocean freight, when goods are made in China, for example, typically the Chinese factory will load the container on site, and pay for the local charges to get to, say, Shanghai port. And then if you're buying on traditionally like FOB terms, which is very typical in our industry, that's where the UK importer will take ownership of the goods when it departs Shanghai. So it'll be loaded onto a boat. The boat at the moment will take typically around anywhere from sort of 45 to 60 days to get into Felixstowe or Southampton. And then it's offloaded at the port and taken straight to their warehouse. So from a pricing perspective, air freight is typically used when goods are very urgent and time critical. Ocean freight typically is utilized for planned inventory that's the bread and butter of the business. It is the cheapest method of shipping freight in the quantities that are shipped. Ocean and air freight really allows businesses to understand how it all centers around when is the cargo ready and when must it arrive into the UK. And then you look at the transit times involved and choose the most appropriate one.
So you must have to liaise closely with your clients, when they need their stock availability, actually to their warehouse, don't you? Not to the dock. They need it to their warehouse by certain dates for people like Christmas peak and Easter, etc.
Absolutely, and it really depends on the industry you're working with. So, say the automotive sector. It could be that parts are on production lines which have to arrive by a certain time. Otherwise, the parts, the production lines could go down. With say, for example, with Black Friday, businesses have had to plan and prepare for this stock months in advance to make sure that their inventory is topped up to the right levels. So what we do is really work closely with businesses, not just moving their freight from A to B, but really helping them plan and prepare for what they need to order, and giving them the insights so that they can decide how much of certain products they need to order and when they need to order it by. I think what you typically see in the e-commerce and fashion environment is a product could be put on an Instagram post by an influencer and sold out an hour later. And in those scenarios, obviously, you have to then restock up your products and get it back over as quickly as possible. So, businesses have to be very agile. We talk a lot in our industry about clean data and dirty data. And what we mean by clean data is making sure that what data is available to you is accurate and it's something which is actionable. Because if the data that's provided to you or you're working off is inaccurate, that makes it much harder for you to plan a lean supply chain accordingly. So, we take a very client-focused relationship with ours, and we work very closely with them, not just to move the freight, but to help them plan their purchasing decisions.
No, I appreciate that. And sometimes you hear on ocean freight of blank sailing. So what is a blank sailing?
Yeah, so a blank sailing is where a shipping line has withdrawn a sailing schedule that was due to depart, typically 3 or 4 weeks later. And what the shipping lines will do is they'll see their order book and see the supply and demand for the ships, and they will try and plan accordingly for the amount of space they want to have in the market, so that the boats that are departing typically are 90% plus full. What shipping lines don't want is to have a glut of capacity available each week, but a low manufacturing demand to fill up that space. In those environments, that's where we typically see rate erosions fall very quickly, because shipping lines start fighting with each other to get space, to get people to buy space on their plane. On their boat. So a blank sailing is very much, mitigating the available space to ensure that they are getting the best rate possible for their container.
Yeah, charge what the market will bear, as they say in every business. And does that make it hard when you have a blank sailing that someone may have committed to stock, and could it affect their stock, or do they not allow that to happen?
Yeah, it absolutely does. It's very harmful potentially to importers, because what they've planned for arrival dates to meet certain key parts of their business. You mentioned like we talk about Black Friday or Valentine's Day or Easter, depending what industry you're in. So with a blank sailing, what typically happens is obviously you have to then go to a different carrier to see what shipping schedule you can get from them at short notice. But if that carrier is full, then you might have to wait the following week to get your goods to depart. So not only at origin, obviously the blank sailings don't always happen when the shipping lines want them to create blank sailings. So this year, for example, we've seen at the start of the year when the boats had to start navigating around Africa, for example, rather than going through the Suez Canal. The boats, didn't go back to Asia in time. So at very short notice and unexpectedly, up to 30% of the market was withdrawn at quite a short notice because the boats were taking longer to get back to Asia than was anticipated. So that created a real shortage of space available that was really driven by world factors, not even the shipping lines driving the market. Hopefully that gives you a good picture of how and when blank sailings can occur within the industry.
Yeah, it's very volatile and changeable, isn't it? Dynamic. Yeah, it's very dynamic the way it works, for sure. I appreciate that.
We talk about predictability and unpredictability are two huge factors in freight forwarding and supply chain. I think if you talk to any business, they don't mind what the price is necessarily for the container, but they want stability to know that when they're pricing their product and it's taking 2 or 3 months to come in, that it's a fair playing level field, that when they're selling their product, everyone's paying a similar price. But when freight rates fluctuate, you can have, for example, a tire importer's warehouse with tires that they've imported at, say, £10,000 a container at the start of the year, and then by the end of the year, the freight rate could be 2,000. So depending on who's held the most inventory, very quickly they could be losing money on the goods that they've imported at the start of the year. So having access to the right data and accurate data really helps them make those purchasing decisions.
Thank you. It's really good. So please describe the sort of current challenges in your marketplace at this time.
Yeah. So I think recently, for example, you've seen the US election. I think yes. It's obvious that obviously with Trump who won, he's very much America first. There's a lot of talk about potential tariffs that are coming into the marketplace, and so a challenge, is there going to be a rush to get as much product in as possible before these tariffs come in? World events, when COVID happened, all of a sudden, all the planes that were in the sky were floored the next day, and so again, those then lead to a supply and demand issue. Obviously, with COVID, the market very, very quickly shifted from getting manufactured goods in for consumer goods to the PPE, which came in via various methods. It's really that, and it's different world events. For example, there could be bad weather going around South Africa, which means that the goods can't go around the Cape of Good Hope for a week. That adds to a week of vessels not arriving into Felixstowe on time. When we had the Evergreen blockage, which pretty much everyone's heard of, when that boat got stuck in the Suez Canal, the ripple effects of that delay by a week or 10 days was huge in terms of the lag of containers which then arrived, and that caused 2 or 3 months of challenges for the industry to recover from just that 1 week or 10 days worth of delays. So it's very much whatever event is happening around the world, not necessarily affected by a human, but whichever course it is.
Okay, thank you. And if you look over the next sort of 3 to 5 years, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for your sector?
I think when everything's going right and sailing schedules are reliable, that's where there's a stability and predictability around when you can plan your arrivals. And so I guess one of the opportunities that we have as a business being technology focused is there's a real desire and need in 2024 for real-time visibility, and by digitalizing supply chains, you're not just relying on, for example, the carrier data, which is what traditional freight forwarders work to. There's a lot of vessel tracking information now via GPS tracking, for example. There's port integrations, and it gives the importer much more real-time information. So in this unpredictable world that we live in, where mitigating factors can change the price of a freight container, for example, the real, I guess, the threat is that there's a lot of unpredictability, which makes it very difficult for businesses to plan, prepare, and price their stock. But the opportunity to the freight forwarding industry is that there's a real need for digitalization to give people as much visibility into both their containers and their inventory as possible, to allow them to make these decisions and order the right amount of stock. If you order too much stock, you'd be left with dead stock you can't sell. It's very much about having access to the data to allow you to make those decisions.
Thank you. And in some ways, you answered already my next question about the threat. So really appreciate that. What are your people in the sector not talking about that perhaps they should be?
I think one of the big issues which people aren't aware of is the average age, for example, of UK haulage drivers. I remember when there was a shortage of drivers, for example, after Brexit and COVID, a lot of the supermarkets were offering large incentives to get drivers to come and work for them, and that really did affect our industry, because these drivers do work long hours, but it wasn't that the talent pool that they had to go to was really the haulage sector in the UK, and the shipping line, and container haulage driving is one of the large parts from there. And I think the average age of a driver now is in the late 40s, early 50s. Going into freight forwarding isn't necessarily the first thing people think about when they're leaving school or university. So I think I think certainly from a UK haulage perspective, there's a real challenge to really make it attractive going into the industry. And I think, like we said at the start, I think a lot of people do stumble into supply chain and logistics through one way or the other. But what I would say is it's been, I really enjoy working in this industry. And it's a really fun place to work. You get to be at the centerpiece of, I get to talk to businesses and the founders of businesses who go from 0 to 25 million pounds turnover in 3 years, and understand what's driving certain industries. And what I would say to anyone listening to this who is thinking about a potential career in logistics and supply chain is, it's not boring. It's not a 9 to 5 one. You're staring at the clock. Things can happen at 5 o'clock, which turn your evening into a different one. So, but with that, you get a huge amount of satisfaction when you do deliver deliver for the client on time, and the effect that you can have on someone's business.
Yeah, well said. And I think the average age of the drivers is early 50s. I think it's 53, 55. Right. And anecdotally, in my normal day job, I talk to a lot of people, and there is a driver shortage potential there. When the economic world picks up, we could have another squeeze, and part of several of the industries are trying to make it more attractive to get drivers into it, because it's a good industry if you get into it, but it's not sexy, for want of a better word, so we've got to work on that together. Okay, thank you. How do you see the green transition, which in some ways you're part of, impacting your sector?
Yeah, so there's no secret about it. Transport and logistics is such a large contributor to the emissions that get, the emissions and the carbon footprints of us. And you'll see the initiatives of all really major freight forwarders and courier companies alike, bringing down your carbon footprint and introducing green vehicles is a huge one. I think the biggest shift that I've personally seen is with regards to decarbonisation of supply chains is 5 or 6 years ago, it was about offsetting your carbon emissions through planting trees. That was generally accepted as doing the right thing. I think as people buying tops and jeans and whatever it is online, and call it the Gen Z community, for example, they want that when they decide to make a purchase, 75% of them will look at the carbon credentials of the company they're buying at. And so these communities get built up of brands who are taking it seriously. One of the big driving factors in the freight forwarding world is the drive towards carbon insetting, which essentially is where we're looking to drive change within the industry. So whether that be the shipping lines buying more energy efficient fuel, for example, that does cost more than traditional fuel, but does burn less emissions. On the Airfreight side, there's it's about potentially using SAF, for example, sustainable aviation fuel. But what people don't look at is all these things cost money, and actually to solve the big problem around the fuel burning side, that there isn't enough of this sustainable fuel to be bought to counteract for all the global emissions. And so, one thing we do through technology is allow companies, for example, to consolidate shipments so that they're shipping less shipments and getting more shipments into a single shipment, which means that they can reduce the amount of imports they're having to make, which reduces their supply chains. If you look at the airlines, for example, Emirates have got a new initiative called fuel, to reduce the fuel burn, and that's where the pilots are kind of using different times to use certain amounts of fuel. But I guess the drive towards carbon insetting is really where the industry is going, and planting trees really isn't deemed as good enough as it was 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, it's an evolution, isn't it, rather than a revolution, and change is coming. But no, it's really, really interesting. So thanks for going through that with us. In your sort of your career, what development in the sector has surprised you most in your career so far?
I think when I look back at when I was working for TNT Express as a parcel salesman, we were really dealing with business to business shipments, and this I'm going back to probably 15-16 years ago. But at the time, residential surcharges were in force, and it was obviously because everyone went to business parks to buy their goods, and no one really bought stuff online, or certainly not at the level they do now. So I guess the acceleration of e-commerce has really been a huge development in the sector. And obviously you'll know very well on the parcel side that most deliveries now are to your home as opposed to going business to business. On the freight side, the emergence of e-commerce players, for sure, people like Shein and Temu, for example. Beforehand you'd have almost a non-peak season from March to September, where the air freight rates they'd always come down to a very low level, and then from October through to February you'd have this peak season. But in a very short space of time, companies like those big e-commerce players I've mentioned have taken up a huge amount of capacity. I think one of them, for example, takes up 10 747 planes a day out of Hong Kong, just to give you an example. So they're shipping serious volumes of air freight, which means that it's not a lot harder for other importers to get space, or it just drives the prices up accordingly. So I definitely say the emergence of e-commerce in the world of freight, but also the drive towards digitalization. I think people nowadays have outgrown getting Excel spreadsheets, which they rely on for their visibility into their containers. People want to have digital solutions, and they want to have much more from the freight forwarder than just moving a shipment from A to B. It's very much we've expanded on how we can be a partner to a business, and whether that's giving inventory insights, whether that's helping them finance their inventory from their suppliers. You've really got to look at all the different ways you can add value to a business rather than just moving freight from A to B.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that. And the question I'm asking everyone is, if you could speak to the Prime Minister, then what would you ask them to do to help your business to grow and flourish?
I think it's funny, actually, because the business I was with today, I mentioned a company called GB Tyres, who are one of the largest business-to-business wholesale tyre importers in the UK. And one of the biggest challenges they have is how you price a product to your end customer, because fluctuating freight prices can make it very difficult for a business to make money. That part of their expansion plans, they've acquired some warehouses, and one of the businesses who used to be in one of the warehouses used to supply goods to one of the largest car companies, for example. And at the start of the year, they would agree a price for the product to be sold to them on a 12-month contract. And with the freight prices going back in the COVID times from like $2,000 a container up to $20,000 a container, especially for small businesses, this really hurts them, and it can be the difference between them making 5 or 10% profit or even losing money. So the question I would ask the Prime Minister really is, how can we help and support small and medium businesses navigate the unpredictability in global trade, especially with the prices they have to pay? And what people don't realize is that when a container does cost $10,000, for example, to import rather than $2,000, that means that the end consumer is having to pay much more for the product. So it adds to inflation, and it means that consumers have to spend more for a product. I think I think garden furniture, for example, 60% of the product is the freight cost when you're buying your rattan furniture. And if you remember during the COVID times when everyone was doing up their gardens, that sector had a huge boom. But a lot of that, those 2,000-3,000 garden sets were a lot of the cost of that was the freight price. I'd definitely like to understand from him how he's looking to support small and medium businesses with navigating these huge unpredictable freight fluctuations that have happened certainly in the last couple of years.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's really good. And I just want to say thank you, Rhys, for going through that. It's really interesting to find lots out about the ocean freight and the air freight market and the volatility of it, the changes and the dynamics of the world with, civil unrest, etc., affecting the lane. So I really appreciate it. So I just want to say thank you so much for your time, Rhys. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, David. Yeah, really, like I said, a huge privilege to be on the podcast, and hopefully, gives listeners a little snippet into the insights of how goods come from source through to being sold on the retail sites.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
Thanks, David. Thanks a lot.